Hey, this is Matt Redham. I'm the School and Community Wellness Advisor for Butte County Office of Education. And this is the final video in our series for Marsh Junior High School. And today we're going to cover stress management for teens. Yes. So when I look at everything we've been through as a community, you as parents, myself as a parent, we've covered things like what to watch out for mental health, your stress, grief and loss, trauma, general mental health 101. And when I look at some of the data that's coming out nationwide, that's coming out statewide, one of the most concerning things to me is the rising level of stress in teens. And the reason that's concerning is because it's one thing if, and this can never happen, but let's just say that just teens were stressed. We as parents would see that. We would notice that, especially if it's our kids. But just generally speaking, globally, we would understand if there was a subpopulation that was experiencing something that nobody else was. I think what is really tricky about stress, and especially about crisis, as we've seen, is that it isn't just teens, it's all of us. And what happens when we have a sort of systemic level of stress, it becomes harder to see it in kids. So today we're going to cover very briefly, what do we watch out for? What is stress in teens? And what are some really quick ways that we can teach stress management to kids, or what can we highlight and what can we do as parents? According to the American Psychological Association, teen stress for the first time is beginning to rival that of adults. So that when they look at teen stress through surveys, through research, typically adults report higher levels of stress. Even before the pandemic, even before the disasters here locally, we saw rising levels of stress. But oftentimes, because teens kind of live an interesting life, like compared to us. They don't have a lot of autonomy, but they also have a lot of contact with friends. They have different pressures. And we can easily ask the question, like, is teen stress a thing? Like, what is that? And we know it is. And we know it's a significant thing right now. How do we know this? Well, there has been some research that's come out that looks at, again, the rising level of teen stress. And it's not only concerning because they're reporting stress, but it's also concerning because they're reporting the anticipation that their stress will increase. The American Psychological Association released a survey, and in that, teens reported stress similar to adults, exceeding levels seen as healthy. We have covered stress a lot, and I'll briefly sort of re-look at what stress is. But we know that the reason why we focus on stress, and especially in a developing body and brain, is because stress in high amounts can be devastating, right? It can be devastating not in the acute, like not in the immediate, but over the long term. And when we look at what, as human beings, we prioritize, we tend to prioritize things that have an immediate result. So an immediate result would be if our child is feeling depressed, we can see that, right? And we can see a noticeable shift in behavior. We don't always see that same thing in stress. So what happens is you can have, sort of gradually increasing amounts of stress. And what happens is your body acclimates to each level of stress and desensitizes to it. And it can be harder to see. It can even be harder to feel as somebody who's experiencing that stress. But what is troubling is that we know that any sort of impact on the teen brain concerns us because the rapidity of development, not only as children, but also as teens, sets the stage not only for this wild and incredible growth that happens during the adolescent years, but anything that is introduced that is negative, whether that's a toxin, whether that's tobacco, alcohol, substances, or stress, can have an impact. And we know that one of the impacts of stress is it breaks down the body and the immune system. So 34% of teens predict that their stress is going to increase in the next year. When I think about that as somebody who's worked with mental health and stress for a while, what makes me nervous about that is when you predict stress, I wonder how that impacts your level of perceived stress. And if we just step back for a second and think about it, like, why wouldn't kids predict higher levels of stress? Think about the last 3 years for most kids. In this county, the last 4 years. What they have seen is that every time things seem to be returning to normal, some other wild thing happens. And the result of that wild thing that happens typically is stress. When we talk about stress with teens, and we approach this topic with our kids, it's important not to demonize stress too much, because in many ways it's something they can't avoid. So we don't want to set the stage where we talk about stress, we introduce stress, and kids suddenly interpret that as, if I'm feeling stressed, then I'm in real trouble. So we break it down really into 3 parts: positive stress, tolerable stress, and toxic stress. And we know, right, like we've talked about in other videos, that positive stress is super important. We need it, right? Like if you're studying for a test, you need some positive stress. And oftentimes you're going to have it. And that positive stress sort of kicks us up into this optimal sort of zone of performance. And that's really important when it comes to academics. But even tolerable stress, like the stress that teens will feel in relationship, whether that's a peer relationship or romantic relationship, whether it's the stress of dealing with us as parents, that there are going to be these serious temporary boosts of stress, these stress responses, but these are going to be buffered by us. Or if we're the source of stress, they're probably going to be buffered by peers. Toxic stress, again, is when we have children who live in, students who live in prolonged activation of stress. So they move from one stressful situation to another to another. And if you have experiences of toxic stress, your risk really increases for a whole host of things. So we want to be able to sort of frame stress for our kids and frame that it isn't an all or nothing. It isn't just this or that there's some nuance when it comes to stress. So let's think about what is stressing teens out right now. Well, we know this. We did it was last school year, we saw some rising rates of suicidal ideation in certain areas of the county. And we got concerned, and we partnered with NVCF and Butte County Behavioral Health. And we looked at, like, through focus groups, we talked to teenagers, like, what is going on? Like, how are you doing? And stress was one of the first things they talked about. And again, we have seen this for a while. The APA in 2013 released a survey, and it said 83% of teens indicated school was the most significant source of stress. Academics, grades, all of the stuff that goes along with school. And that there was some real concern about those rising levels of stress and anxiety within the academic system. But recently, as recent as 2018, they released another survey, and about 60 to 80% of Gen Z teens, so this would be our kids, are stressed about social issues. So they're looking at things like gun violence or politics or the climate or just the general state of the world. And they are stressed about those things. They are stressed about the world that they are inheriting. Regardless of where they sit on sort of the political spectrum, there is concern there. And that concern can lead to stress. And again, I'll say one of the most, I think the things that pops out for me is none of us are really awesome at dealing with stress. But you look at a teenager and you look at what a teenage brain is able to do, and it's able to do some really cool stuff that our brains actually aren't anymore. But also it's vulnerable, right? It's vulnerable to all sorts of things. So when I look at that number, 60, 80% of Gen Z teens are stressed about social issues. It's concerning because what we can't control are those social issues. So we have to look at what we can control. And part of what we can control is understanding what to watch for in signs of stress in our children. So we have covered a lot of like what to watch for through these videos. And I think there's a lot of crossover. So I pulled out signs of stress in teens that I think are most significant. There's physical, emotional, and behavioral indicators that we can look at. Physical stuff like headaches. Headaches, I mean, sometimes you have headaches because you're legitimately sick, but having a headache can also be highly linked with stress. Just repeatedly reporting that they're tired, stomach issues, so somatic issues and somatic issues usually show up in those two places, headaches and stomach aches. And they don't seem to be tied to any other medical issue. And then sleep loss. We all know that when we are stressed, we don't typically sleep more, we typically sleep less. So there's a loss of sleep. And again, there could be a feedback loop with these. You start to lose sleep, you start to get tired, you lose sleep, you start to be more amenable to like physical difficulties. We also see emotional responses. Irritability can be relatively common in teens, period. So there's days when they just wake up and you're like, your head's spinning around. But irritability, especially in conjunction with some of those physical symptoms, can indicate potential signs of stress. Anxiety and stress are like really, really, really similar. Anxiety is contextual. It's like typically about a certain thing or a certain type of things. Stress can just be global. Feelings of numbness. So what happens when you're in the exhaustive phase of stress, when you've tried to push against it, your body's tried to battle it and it can't anymore, you do get numb, you get fatigued, you get numb. And then angry outbursts that seem to come out of nowhere. Behaviorally, you could see neglecting of responsibilities, a drop in school performance, just general restlessness, especially if it's a kid who isn't generally restless, excessive crying, and then panic. So stress can lead to this feeling of just not being able to deal with it. And I think what we have seen more this year than we have in a long time, our kids were just breaking down, right? And they will tell you the great thing about having a teen, and I have one, is it can be hard to talk about certain things, especially feelings and stress, but like they can do it, right? So they can put it into words, whereas younger kids, they have a little more trouble with that. So what can teens themselves do to deal with stress? Many of the same things that we do, but I would say that they actually have greater opportunities to engage in things like exercise. This doesn't necessarily mean having a regimented routine and making them work out. Exercise is about getting your heart rate up. So being involved in extracurricular activities can help tremendously. Going on walks can help tremendously. The next thing we look at is sleeping well. It is critical that teenagers usually get about 10 hours of sleep. If they're not consistently getting 10 hours of sleep, it makes them a little more vulnerable to stress. Talk it out. Talk with you, talk with a therapist, talk with a relative that they're close to, a friend. Make sure that they understand that talking about stress can mediate stress. It can dampen it. Making time for fun. Make sure they have time to do things that they want to do. Sometimes there's a difference between getting on games and, Roblox and your brain melts for 12 hours. That might not be fun. That might be coping. So I want to make sure that they're getting out and doing things that you can tell they're enjoying. And then also making time for quiet, like giving them space to just block everything out. They are assaulted by media. They are assaulted by drama. That is part of what it means to be a teenager, and especially a young teen. So having some time set aside to do nothing is super important. Getting outside, again, just being outside can mediate stress. Writing, not all kids like to write. Some love to do that, but encourage, write about what is stressing you out. And then practicing mindfulness. So there are some simple techniques and tools that they can use to ground themselves. 3-2-1 exercise, 3 things you see, 3 things you hear, 3 things you physically feel. All of these can be super helpful in battling stress. What can we as parents do? I mean, that's often the hardest part. The number one thing we can do, and I'm going to be straight up real with you, the hardest thing to do is modeling how to deal with stress. It's hard to do right now. But talking to kids about what we do when we're highly stressed, what we look like, what we sound like. By the way, they're going to be like, oh, is that what you look like and sound like? I had no idea, because they already know. But giving them the other side of that, which is how do we manage? In conjunction with that is let your child be the problem solver. So we can talk about our own experience. We could talk about some options of like, here are some things that could help, but let them figure out what works best for them. Teenagers are about autonomy. They have to come up with the idea if they're going to do it, typically. Help your child be social media literate is super important. So much of these pressures might begin at school, but they get ramped up on social media. So making sure your child understands the dangers, the fun, the interesting parts, the risk of being on social media. Make sure you limit it. Teach your child to combat negative thinking. A lot of stress is physical, and it is also cognitive. We have thoughts that go along with interacting with the world when we're stressed. And we have a certain pattern of cognition when we're experiencing stress. This is true of any of us. I have to, I should, if I don't, then this will happen. You're not good enough. You're going to screw this up. We have to give them tools to combat that negative thinking. So talking about what, self-statements that might feel effective for them. I am good enough. I can do this. I know I'm really stressed right now. This is just my stress talking. This is my anxiety talking. It is critical to do that. We have such negative bias in our thinking. Like, it's probably adaptive, it's evolutionary, but we need to help kids, probably ourselves while we're doing it, instill messages that can battle back and push against that. And then lastly, and I've talked about this a lot in these videos, check in frequently, preferably through a routine at dinner, a routine when they come home from school, a routine before bed. But make sure you're checking in about levels of stress. It can be incredibly helpful. This has been a long year. This has been a long 3 years. And this stuff isn't just going to go away now that we're sort of back into some sense of predictability again. And it is critical that we identify not only the risk involved with these things, whether it's mental health or traumatic stress or grief and loss or stress in ourselves or stress in teens, but that we also highlight that when we're effectively able to navigate these things, we grow, right? Our resilience grows. Our ability to understand who we are, what we can tolerate, and how amazing we are will only increase when we effectively navigate all of these remarkable things that we've been through. I hope you found some value in these videos. I hope you're going to have a summer filled with some relaxing time. And take care of yourselves and take care of one another. Thanks so much.